Two Chinese Americans were arrested for allegedly operating a secret police station on behalf of the Chinese government in the heart of New York City. One of them, 61-year-old Lu Jianwang, was seen leaving a Brooklyn federal courthouse on Monday after he was released on bond. On the far left in this court sketch is 59-year-old Chen Jinping. The pair face charges of conspiring to act as agents of Beijing without informing US authorities and obstructing justice. In addition, federal prosecutors also on Monday unveiled charges for many others suspected of harassing US-based Chinese dissidents. According to authorities, Lu and Chen worked from an office in a nondescript building near the Manhattan Bridge. Before it closed in 2022, the office described itself as a gathering spot for people from China's Fujian province. The site appeared to help Chinese nationals with paperwork like renewing their driver's licenses. But US Attorney Breon Peace said on Monday there was more beneath the surface.
The secret police station appears to have had a more sinister use. On at least one occasion, an official with the Chinese National Police directed one of the defendants, a US citizen who worked at the secret police station, to help locate a pro-democracy activist of Chinese descent living in California. In other words, the Chinese National Police appear to have been using the station to track a US resident on US soil.
Once they got whiff the FBI was onto them, Lu and Chen deleted their communications with a Chinese government official, which they later admitted to FBI agents. The charges also state Lu tried to persuade a Chinese dissident to return to China in 2018. The victim reported he was repeatedly harassed, his family in the US received threats of violence, and Chinese officers harassed his family in China. US prosecutors on Monday also unveiled charges for 42 other Chinese nationals. They include 34 public security officers belonging to a task force allegedly operating as a troll farm, creating fake profiles to harass and threaten dissidents and activists online. And 8 Chinese government officials are now listed as defendants in a case announced in 2020, charging a former China-based executive of Zoom with disrupting video meetings commemorating the 1989 Tiananmen Square protests, which is a taboo subject in China. Beijing's embassy in Washington has yet to respond to a request for comment. Last October, charges were unsealed against 7 Chinese nationals alleged to be part of a state-sponsored campaign to strong-arm dissidents to repatriate to China. In November, FBI Director Christopher Wray told a Senate committee he was very concerned about the presence of stations in other US cities like the alleged one in New York.
We're not going to allow self-governing for any one big corporation.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis fired back at Disney on Monday in an intensifying battle between the likely presidential contender and one of the state's largest employers, announcing that the Republican-controlled state legislature will file a bill to formally nullify a development agreement with Disney.
This is basically a sham agreement.
After the Magic Kingdom struck a deal with outgoing members of a special district board to circumvent state oversight of its parks and tie the hands of DeSantis' appointees.
I mean, they thought that they could create some type of development agreements that would essentially render everything that we did null and void and put them in control in perpetuity for this. Well, that's not going to work. That's not going to fly.
Florida lawmakers passed a bill in February giving DeSantis effective control over a board that oversees the special district that encompasses the Walt Disney World Resort. But 3 weeks before the takeover by DeSantis appointees, Disney pushed through changes to the agreement that limited the board's action for decades.
Disney stay gay, we won't go away.
The Republican governor began targeting Disney a year ago after the company's then CEO spoke out against Florida's Don't Say Gay law. Critics of DeSantis say the Republican is weaponizing the power of the state to retaliate against a corporation that disagrees with his policies.
We fight the woke in the schools. We fight the woke in the corporations.
DeSantis and the Republican-dominated Florida legislature have since been working to eliminate the virtual autonomy the company has enjoyed over Walt Disney World since the 1960s.
Whatever rationale there was 60 years ago to do that, clearly now we're in a much different era as a state.
The agreement reached with the previous oversight board gives Disney widespread control over future construction and would remain in force until 21 years after the death of the last survivor of the descendants of King Charles, a legal provision used in contracts to extend a right in perpetuity.
An Ohio grand jury voted against indicting police officers in the shooting death of an unarmed black man in Akron last year, according to the state attorney general on Monday, as the city prepared for a fresh round of protests against alleged police misconduct. Ohio Attorney General Dave Yost said at a press conference, quote, "The grand jury concluded that the officers were legally justified in their use of force." Last June, 8 Akron police officers shot Jayland Walker 46 times, including 5 times in the back. An autopsy found that Walker had no drugs or alcohol in his system. The shooting took place after officers attempted to pull over Walker's car for a traffic violation. After over a 7-minute car chase in which police said they saw a firearm discharged from Walker's car, he jumped out of the moving vehicle and ran. Officers caught up to Walker in a parking lot, where police opened fire, believing that he posed a deadly threat to them. A gun was later found in Walker's vehicle. The state attorney general added that the panel found Walker had shot at officers with a gun that he recently purchased, and the officers had initially used non-lethal tasers in an attempt to stop him. After Walker's death and the release of the body camera footage last summer, protests overtook Akron as community members and activist groups demanded transparency in the case.
The Republican leader of the U.S. House of Representatives on Monday proposed a deal to raise the federal debt ceiling in exchange for spending cuts.
Our proposal will examine wasteful Washington spending and executive overreach in all forms. Among other items, it will claw back tens of billions of dollars in COVID-related money.
The proposal by House Speaker Kevin McCarthy at the New York Stock Exchange comes as the federal government ticks closer to the moment sometime this summer when it will no longer be able to pay its bills, including interest on its debt, without legislation to increase the current $31.4 trillion borrowing limit. Without action by the divided Congress, that failure would trigger a historic default that would shake the U.S. and world economies.
Let me be clear, defaulting on our debt is not an option. But neither is a future of higher taxes, higher interest rates, more dependency on China, an economy that doesn't work for working Americans.
But McCarthy has already floated this proposal, one rejected by Democrats. President Joe Biden's Democrats, who also control the Senate, have been at loggerheads with Republicans for months over next steps on the limit, with the White House insisting Congress lift the borrowing limit without conditions, as it did 3 times under former Republican President Donald Trump. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer.
The solution here is straightforward. Republicans should work with Democrats in good faith to avoid default, together, just as we did under President Trump. Just as what President Reagan talked about. No blackmail, no brinksmanship, no default.
Democrats also have pushed McCarthy to lay out a specific budget plan. So far, House Republicans have not proposed a budget of their own, a move Biden contends would be a necessary starting point for negotiations on spending. McCarthy and Republicans hold a narrow 222 to 213 majority, including a contingent of hardline members who dismiss the risks of failure to act on the debt ceiling. The White House last month proposed its own budget, which it said would cut the nation's deficit by nearly $3 trillion over 10 years, though it relied on increases in taxes on businesses and the wealthy rather than spending cuts to do so.
China's economy has rebounded more than expected after the country's so-called zero COVID restrictions were dropped in December. New figures released by the National Bureau of Statistics on Tuesday showed GDP grew 4.5% in the first 3 months of this year, beating expectations from analysts who forecasted slightly lower. Investors have been closely watching the first quarter data for clues on the strength of China's recovery, following the dropping of all COVID curbs and the easing of a 3-year crackdown on tech firms and property. The growth was driven in part by retail sales, which grew more than 10% in March, a near 2-year high. Strong export growth in the same stretch of months also gave the economy a boost, but a spokesperson for China's Statistics Bureau said the outlook remained uncertain.
但也要看到呢，
But we must also see that the international environment is still complex. There are uncertainties in the growth of external demand, insufficient constraints in domestic market demand still exist, and the prices of industrial products are still falling.
The new figures still mark a turnaround for the world's second largest economy after its GDP growth last year slumped to one of its worst in nearly half a century. The January to March growth rate was, however, short of the government's full-year target of 5%. Chinese policymakers have pledged to step up support for the $18 trillion economy to keep a lid on unemployment, but they face limited room to maneuver as businesses grapple with debt risks, structural woes, and global recession worries.